It was a cold Tuesday evening on November 9th, 1965, and the northeastern part of North America was running full speed ahead. Families were heating their homes, streetlights were flickering on as night crept in, and kitchens buzzed with the usual dinner time rush. But behind all of this, everyday life was a power grid stretched nearly to its limit, and no one knew that one tiny flaw in the system was about to bring everything crashing down. At exactly 5:16 p.m., something strange happened near the border between Ontario and New York. A protective relay, a kind of safety switch built into a transmission line, was triggered at the Sir Adam Beck Hydroelectric Power Station No. 2, not far from Niagara Falls. That one piece of equipment had been misprogrammed. It wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was told to do, just not in the right situation. The system had been designed to shut down if it sensed something going wrong deeper within Ontario Hydro's massive network. And on that chilly November night, the demand for power was spiking higher than usual. The lines were working hard, maybe harder than they should have been. What happened next was like a domino effect on steroids. The relay tripped. One transmission line shut down. That forced all the power it had been carrying to surge into the other lines nearby. But they couldn't handle it either, and one by one they overloaded and shut themselves off too. This instantly cut off the Sir Adam Beck station from southern Ontario. Suddenly that whole region lost its main source of power. Now, with nowhere else for the electricity to go, the excess load was pushed east into New York State, but the grid there wasn't built to handle it either. Power lines began tripping in New York as well, overwhelmed by the rush of redirected energy. The pressure built fast. In just minutes, the electrical system throughout the Northeast fell into chaos. Power stations were going dark. The grid was breaking apart into isolated pockets, each one trying to survive on its own. Some places managed for a few minutes, others collapsed right away. By 5:17 p.m., only 60 seconds after that first relay tripped, the blackout had officially begun. Whole regions, parts of Ontario, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and more were thrown into darkness. Over 30 million people were affected. It wasn't just a flicker, this was the kind of failure that made everything stop. Subways froze, elevators stalled, radio stations started to slow down. Even the music on the airwaves began sounding off pitch because the electricity running the machines wasn't stable anymore. Nobody expected a single setting on a single piece of equipment to bring down the lights in more than 10 states and part of a Canadian province. That's exactly what happened, and within minutes, engineers across the Northeast were scrambling to figure out how something so small had caused something so big. As the lights blinked out across the Northeast, confusion set in instantly. In New York City, rush hour was in full swing. Thousands of commuters had just packed onto subway cars when the trains ground to a halt deep below the city streets. Within moments, the entire subway system stopped operating, leaving nearly 800,000 people stranded underground. Emergency lights flickered on in some cars, others went completely dark. Above-ground intersections quickly turned chaotic. With traffic signals dead, cars jammed the streets. Pedestrians were left to direct traffic with flashlights and hand gestures, while police scrambled to manage major roadways without any electronic assistance. In just a few minutes, New York, a city that never sleeps, felt frozen in place. But the blackout wasn't just hitting New York. In Boston, thousands of people had to make their way home on foot. Streetcars and trolleys shut down mid-route, leaving entire neighborhoods eerily quiet. In parts of Ontario, the sudden loss of power created a different kind of concern. Temperatures were falling, and without electricity, homes and buildings with electric heating grew cold fast. Emergency centers began filling with people seeking warmth and light. Airports were forced to close almost immediately. With radar systems offline and no runway lights, planes were diverted or grounded. Over 30 commercial flights had to be rerouted within the first hour. Passengers sat waiting in terminals lit only by candles and battery-powered lanterns. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers tried to manage communications by phone, struggling to stay in contact with pilots flying blind above the region. Hospitals switched to backup generators, but the load was heavy, and not every system made the transition smoothly. In some places, patients were manually ventilated by nurses using hand pumps. Surgeries in progress were paused or performed under dim lighting. In one New Jersey hospital, the emergency room had to be cleared because their power systems failed completely. There was no warning. People didn't have time to prepare. Food spoiled in refrigerators. Water pressure dropped in apartment buildings. Radios, which many people relied on for news, began to fade in and out as transmission towers lost power or failed to switch over to emergency supply. For many, the blackout wasn't just a loss of electricity, it felt like a total breakdown of normal life. Yet in all this darkness, something unexpected began to happen. Strangers helped each other. Store owners handed out flashlights and batteries without charging. People opened their homes to neighbors who had no heat. Even as modern systems failed, human connection began to take over. And while millions tried to adapt to the silence and the dark, utility companies were just beginning to understand what they were really dealing with. A massive, unexpected failure, still spreading in ways no one could predict. As power grids across the Northeast collapsed, engineers and technicians were left scrambling in the dark, both literally and figuratively. In control rooms from Pennsylvania to Quebec, blinking consoles offered little insight. Most believed at first that a single line or transformer had failed, but as hours passed, it became clear that the issue was something far more complex. What baffled experts the most was the scale. Entire regions connected through vast networks of transmission lines had gone silent almost all at once. The first suspicions leaned toward human error. Was a technician somewhere responsible for triggering this massive chain reaction? Others considered sabotage, a fear not uncommon during the Cold War. Military officials monitored radar systems closely, watching for signs of an attack, even though no direct evidence pointed in that direction. Still, the suddenness of the outage had a kind of surgical precision that left many uneasy. Meanwhile, workers in Ontario Hydro's control center began narrowing their search. They noticed a strange drop in power flow near the Sir Adam Beck power station in Queenston. This station, one of the largest in Canada at the time, fed power into key transmission lines that crossed into the United States. Just before the blackout spread, there had been an unexpected surge of electricity rerouted back into the Canadian grid. This was not normal. As engineers followed the trail, they landed on a crucial piece of equipment, a single transmission line near Ontario's border with New York. On that line sat a protective device, a relay designed to cut off power if the system was overloaded. It was supposed to act like a safety valve, shutting off flow to prevent damage. But something had gone wrong. The relay had tripped, not because of a massive overload, but due to a miscalibrated setting. It reacted to a perfectly normal flow of electricity as if it were a threat, and disconnected the line. That small break caused nearby lines to take on extra load, which then triggered their own safety shutoffs. The collapse began moving outward, like falling dominoes. What no one realized until that night was just how tightly interconnected the Northeastern power grid had become. A problem in one small section didn't stay local. It quickly rippled across multiple states and provinces. Within minutes, the grid's entire balance fell apart. Still, even with the suspected cause in view, restoring power wasn't simple. Technicians had to carefully restart sections one at a time. Too much load added too quickly could cause another failure. It took careful coordination between companies across international borders to begin bringing the lights back. Throughout the night, the investigation deepened. Utility officials, engineers, and government leaders began to ask hard questions. How could a single faulty relay plunge over 30 million people into darkness? And if it could happen once, could it happen again? By the early hours of the next morning, the massive blackout was slowly being reversed. Electricity returned to sections of Manhattan just before dawn. In Boston, streetlights flickered on after more than 10 hours of complete darkness. Toronto and other Canadian cities saw power restored in phases as crews worked through the night with extraordinary caution. Once the worst had passed, attention shifted to public reaction, and it was not what many had feared. Despite the panic that could have erupted in such a large-scale outage, the public response was, by most accounts, remarkably calm. In New York City, thousands of people were trapped in subway cars, but most waited patiently until help arrived. Others helped direct traffic at intersections when signals went dark. In hospitals, staff worked by flashlight and candlelight to continue caring for patients. Emergency services were tested but not overwhelmed. Some looting did occur, but it was isolated. In fact, many officials noted that crime actually dropped during the blackout. The general mood, once the shock faded, turned reflective. Newspapers and radio broadcasts praised the way communities had pulled together during the crisis. In Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson quickly took notice. He ordered the Federal Power Commission to conduct a full investigation, not just into the technical cause of the blackout, but into the design of the entire power grid. Questions were raised in Congress about how such a vast system had no built-in safeguards to prevent a single failure from spreading. Utility companies, now under heavy scrutiny, began to rethink how they monitored and controlled electricity across state and national borders. It was clear that the grid had outgrown its original structure. The rapid post-war expansion of cities and industries had pushed the system to new limits, but the planning had not kept pace. One of the biggest revelations of the post-blackout analysis was the lack of coordination between regional utilities. Each company had its own control center, its own procedures, and its own priorities. While they were physically connected through power lines, their decision-making remained disconnected. In short, the system had grown large without becoming truly unified. In response, a series of reforms began to take shape. Discussions emerged around creating shared regional oversight and better emergency response protocols. Within months, plans were proposed for more sophisticated monitoring equipment and real-time communication between utility providers. Although the blackout lasted less than one full day, its impact on infrastructure policy was long-lasting. It exposed the fragility of systems that millions depended on daily, and it brought energy planning into the spotlight like never before. The Northeast blackout of 1965 was not just a momentary power outage, it was a wake-up call that changed the way electrical systems were viewed and managed. In the aftermath, investigators, utility companies, and government officials worked together to understand what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. The main lesson learned was the importance of system coordination. While the grid had been interconnected to share power more efficiently, it had not been managed as a single unit. That lack of coordination allowed a single failure in Ontario to ripple through multiple states. After the blackout, both American and Canadian utilities began building more structured communication systems between regional operators. Engineers began designing new kinds of protective relays and circuit breakers. These devices would better respond to sudden shifts in voltage or frequency and isolate a problem before it could spread. Control rooms were upgraded with real-time monitoring systems, giving operators more information about what was happening across the grid at any given moment. The event also led to the creation of new institutions. In the United States, the electric industry formed the North American Electric Reliability Council in the late 1960s. Its mission was to develop standards, train operators, and ensure that different regions of the continent could work together to avoid large-scale outages. The council eventually evolved into what is now the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, still active today. On a broader level, the blackout changed how people thought about infrastructure. It showed that even the most modern systems could fail. Cities and states began to include electrical failures in emergency planning. Hospitals invested in better backup power. Schools and businesses reviewed their procedures for dealing with long outages. For the public, the blackout remained a shared memory for decades. People who lived through it often described the night as both eerie and peaceful. There was a little panic, and in many places, neighbors helped one another. It became a story passed down through generations. A reminder of how one moment of failure could bring millions to a stop and how quickly life could change without warning. Though power was restored within a day, the shadow of that night lasted much longer. It reshaped the future of electricity in North America, and it proved that preparation, cooperation, and smart design were not just technical goals, they were essential to daily life. In late October of 2020, the Pacific Ocean gave birth to one of the most powerful storms ever recorded, Typhoon Goni, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Rolly. This storm wasn't just strong, it was extraordinary. Goni started as a small tropical depression just south of Guam on October 26th. Within a day, it grew into a tropical storm and was given the name Goni by meteorologists. The name means swan in Korean, which is an interesting contrast to the destruction this storm would later bring. Over the next few days, Goni moved westward across the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. These warm waters acted like fuel, helping the storm gain incredible strength. By October 30th, Goni exploded in power, rapidly intensifying into a Category 5 super typhoon. That means it had sustained winds stronger than most hurricanes and typhoons that people are used to hearing about. At its peak, Goni had winds reaching almost 195 miles per hour, making it the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded to hit land based on 1-minute sustained winds. Imagine winds so strong they could rip roofs off buildings, uproot trees, and toss cars around like toys. The storm's eye, the calm center, Kurapro, was perfectly round and very small, something meteorologists call a pinhole eye. This often means the storm is at its absolute strongest. Goni maintained this intense power for more than a full day as it headed straight for the Philippines. On the evening of October 31st, it made landfall on Catanduanes, an island in the Bicol region of the country. It struck with full force, bringing catastrophic winds and torrential rains. What made this storm especially dangerous was not just the wind, but also the massive flooding it caused. As Goni barreled over the mountainous areas of the Philippines, heavy rains mixed with volcanic debris created deadly lahars, fast-moving flows of mud and volcanic ash, especially near Mayon Volcano, one of the country's most active volcanoes. These lahars swept through communities, damaging homes and blocking roads, making it hard for people to escape or receive help. Before the storm hit, the Philippine government and disaster agencies worked quickly to prepare. They issued warnings and started evacuations. Hundreds of thousands of people were moved to safer places. But the situation was complicated by the ongoing pandemic. Evacuation centers were already crowded with people seeking shelter from the virus, so managing both threats at once was a huge challenge. Despite the preparations, the typhoon caused widespread damage. Power lines went down, leaving many areas in darkness. Crops were destroyed, which affected the food supply. Roads and bridges were blocked by debris and flooding, isolating some communities. It was clear that this was one of the worst storms the Philippines had faced in recent memory. After Super Typhoon Rolly made landfall on Catanduanes Island, it didn't lose much strength as it moved across the Bicol region. Instead, the storm maintained its powerful winds and heavy rains as it swept across the provinces of Albay, Camarines Sur, and Sorsogon. The destruction followed everywhere the typhoon passed. Houses made of light materials were torn apart, and even concrete buildings suffered serious damage. Trees were snapped like twigs, and countless power poles were downed, leaving many towns without electricity for days. One of the hardest hit areas was the town of Tiwi in Albay. There, the strong winds peeled off roofs and caused flooding that reached knee-deep in some streets. Rescue workers faced dangerous conditions trying to reach people trapped by fallen trees and landslides. The storm's intense rain caused rivers to overflow quickly, washing away bridges and cutting off entire communities from emergency assistance. Schools, government offices, and businesses across the region were closed for several days as people focused on cleanup and recovery. The typhoon destroyed many boats and fishing equipment, which left coastal communities struggling because fishing is their main source of income. Many families lost everything they had, including their homes and belongings. Typhoon Rolly continued to move inland and weaken gradually, but its effects lasted long after the winds died down. Floodwaters lingered, and landslides blocked roads for weeks, making it difficult to bring food, water, and medicine to the worst affected areas. Power outages also slowed down relief efforts, and some places remained in the dark for more than a week. The Philippine government declared a state of calamity in the Bicol region to speed up aid and allow funds to be used for emergency repairs. Thousands of soldiers and volunteers were sent out to assist with rescue missions, distribute relief goods, and help clear debris. Despite these efforts, many people faced tough days ahead, with no electricity, damaged homes, and little access to clean water. In addition to physical destruction, the typhoon had a severe impact on the local economy. Farmers lost their crops just before harvest, and many workers could not get to their jobs. Markets closed, and prices for basic goods rose sharply. For many families, the storm caused financial hardship that would take months or even years to recover from. Typhoon Rolly's rapid arrival also exposed weaknesses in infrastructure. Flood control systems and drainage channels were overwhelmed by the heavy rain, causing unexpected flash floods. Some roads and bridges built years ago could not withstand the storm, highlighting the need for better planning and stronger construction in typhoon-prone areas. In the aftermath of Typhoon Rolly, the focus shifted from immediate rescue to long-term recovery. Many affected communities faced a daunting challenge: rebuilding homes and restoring basic services. Local governments began assessing the damage in detail, finding that thousands of houses were either completely destroyed or severely damaged. Temporary shelters were set up, but overcrowding and lack of sanitation raised concerns about health risks. One of the biggest problems after the typhoon was access to clean drinking water. Wells and water systems were contaminated by floodwaters, increasing the risk of waterborne diseases like diarrhea and cholera. Health officials urged residents to boil water before use, and distributed water purification tablets were possible. Clinics and hospitals struggled to provide care as supplies ran low and some facilities had also been damaged. Schools faced a major setback too. Many buildings lost roofs or suffered structural damage, forcing classes to be suspended for weeks. The Department of Education worked quickly to provide temporary learning spaces and materials, aiming to minimize disruption for thousands of students. Teachers and parents showed strong commitment, organizing lessons in community centers or under makeshift shelters. Agriculture, a vital part of the local economy, was heavily affected. Vast rice fields and plantations were flooded or destroyed just before harvest time. Farmers reported losing not only crops, but also seeds and tools needed for the next planting season. This destruction threatened food security in the region, pushing officials to plan support programs that included seeds distribution, financial aid, and farming training. Transportation infrastructure also needed urgent repairs. Landslides and fallen trees blocked key highways and rural roads, isolating remote villages. Repair crews worked tirelessly to clear debris and fix damaged bridges, but some routes remained impassable for weeks. This made it difficult to transport goods and slowed down economic activity. The electrical grid in many areas was badly damaged, power lines snapped and substations flooded, leaving thousands of households and businesses without electricity. Utility companies prioritized restoring power to hospitals, water facilities, and main towns first, but full restoration took more than a month in some places. The government and several aid organizations launched massive relief operations. Emergency food packs, blankets, and clothing were distributed to thousands of families. Psychosocial support teams were sent to help people cope with trauma and loss. Volunteers played a vital role, working alongside officials to reach even the most isolated communities. Typhoon Rolly also prompted renewed discussions about climate change and disaster preparedness in the Philippines. Experts warned that stronger and more frequent storms could become the new normal due to global warming. Many called for greater investment in resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, and community education to reduce the impact of future disasters. As the weeks passed following Typhoon Rolly, the long-term effects on the region's economy became clearer. Many small businesses, especially those dependent on tourism and agriculture, faced serious setbacks. Local markets were disrupted by the destruction of roads and power outages, reducing the flow of goods and income. Shop owners struggled to restock supplies, and many workers found themselves without jobs as businesses closed temporarily or permanently. In response, the national government launched several recovery programs aimed at jump-starting local economies. Low-interest loans and grants were made available to small business owners to help rebuild and restock. Training sessions were held to improve skills in disaster-resilient business practices, encouraging entrepreneurs to adapt to the new climate realities. One notable challenge was rebuilding schools and hospitals. Some schools had been completely flattened, requiring reconstruction from the ground up. Hospitals faced shortages of equipment and medicines, and some had to refer patients to better equipped facilities in nearby cities. International aid agencies stepped in to provide funds and technical assistance for rebuilding health and education infrastructure. The mental health impact of the typhoon also gained attention. Many survivors suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress due to the loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods. Local health workers began community outreach programs to provide counseling and support groups. Religious and community leaders played a key role in offering comfort and helping people find hope amid the devastation. Environmental damage was another serious concern. Floodwaters and strong winds destroyed forests, uprooted trees, and damaged coral reefs along the coast. This destruction affected biodiversity and weakened natural barriers that protect communities from future storms and flooding. Environmental organizations pushed for reforestation projects and coral reef restoration to help nature recover. Scientists and disaster experts started analyzing data from Typhoon Rolly to improve forecasting models. Satellite images and weather station reports were used to understand how the storm developed and why it caused such severe damage in specific areas. These studies aimed to provide better early warnings and evacuation plans for future typhoons. Community resilience also became a major focus. Many towns began organizing neighborhood disaster response teams trained in first aid, evacuation procedures, and emergency communication. These teams helped reduce casualties and damage during Rolly by acting quickly and efficiently. Schools and local governments held drills to prepare residents for the next storm season. Despite the hardships, stories of kindness and solidarity stood out. Neighbors shared food and shelter. Volunteers traveled from distant provinces to help, and local leaders worked tirelessly to restore normal life. These acts of unity showed the strength of the Filipino spirit in the face of natural disasters. As the recovery efforts continued months after Typhoon Rolly, communities began focusing on long-term solutions to reduce future risks. One important strategy was improving infrastructure to withstand stronger storms. Engineers designed stronger homes with reinforced walls and roofs, and new public buildings were built on higher ground to avoid flooding. Roads and bridges were reconstructed with better materials and designs that allowed water to flow through instead of causing blockages. Local governments also improved their disaster preparedness plans. Early warning systems were upgraded with modern technology, including sirens, text alerts, and community radios, to quickly inform residents of approaching storms. Evacuation centers were expanded and stocked with emergency supplies like food, water, blankets, and medicines to support displaced families. In schools, disaster education became part of the curriculum. Children learned about typhoon safety, first aid, and how to respond during emergencies. This helped build a culture of awareness and readiness among the younger generation, empowering them to protect themselves and their families. Farmers began experimenting with more resilient crops and farming methods. Some switched to rice varieties that tolerate floods, while others built raised beds to protect plants from water damage. These changes aimed to secure food production despite unpredictable weather patterns caused by climate change. The government also worked on environmental restoration projects to reduce the impact of future storms. Mangrove forests, which act as natural barriers against waves and storm surges, were replanted along vulnerable coastlines. Wetlands were preserved and restored to absorb excess rainwater and reduce flooding in nearby towns. International organizations continued to provide support for rebuilding and development. Through partnerships, the affected regions gained access to better technology, training, and financial resources. These collaborations helped build more resilient communities that could better handle future disasters. In reflecting on Typhoon Rolly, experts emphasized the importance of learning from each storm to improve responses and save lives. While the destruction was severe, it highlighted weaknesses that could be addressed before the next disaster. The lessons from Rolly shaped policies and preparedness efforts not only in the Philippines but also in other typhoon-prone countries. Ultimately, the spirit of resilience, cooperation, and hope defined the recovery. Despite the losses, people came together to rebuild stronger, better prepared, and more united. This enduring determination serves as a reminder that while nature's power is immense, human courage and kindness are just as powerful. In the mid-18th century, Lisbon was a thriving city, often described as one of the most prosperous in Europe. The year was 1755, and Lisbon was not just the capital of Portugal, but a bustling hub of trade and cultural exchange. With its strategic location along the Atlantic Ocean, it was an essential port for trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ships filled with goods from distant lands regularly docked in its harbor. Contributing to the city's wealth and influence, Lisbon's streets were lined with beautiful architecture, showcasing its role as a major cultural center. Grand palaces, churches, and squares adorned the city, making it a symbol of European elegance and power. The city's prominence was further solidified by its vibrant cultural scene, which included a flourishing arts community, theaters, and universities. Lisbon, in many ways, represented the peak of European civilization at the time. On the 1st of November, 1755, the city was preparing for the celebration of All Saints' Day, a day filled with religious observance, festivities, and joy. Little did the people of Lisbon know, this day of celebration would soon turn into one of unimaginable devastation. The peaceful city, known for its riches and architectural beauty, was about to experience an event that would change its course forever. The ground beneath Lisbon would soon tremble in a way no one could have predicted, marking the beginning of a disaster that would go down in history as one of the deadliest earthquakes ever recorded. At precisely around 9 a.m. on the 1st of November, 1755, the ground beneath Lisbon began to shake violently. The earthquake, estimated to have a magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0 on the Richter scale, struck with a force that no one could have anticipated. The tremors lasted for several minutes, but in that short amount of time, the destruction was immense. Buildings that had once been symbols of the city's wealth and culture crumbled to the ground, while the ground itself split open in some areas, swallowing everything in its path. As the city's structures collapsed, fires erupted across Lisbon. The tremors had severed gas lines and caused sparks from broken electrical wires, igniting countless fires that raged through the city. With many of the city's water sources disrupted by the earthquake, efforts to contain the fires were futile. The flames consumed what the earthquake hadn't already destroyed. But the disaster didn't end there. Just hours after the earthquake struck, the ocean itself seemed to turn against the city. A massive tsunami, triggered by the seismic activity beneath the ocean floor, slammed into the coast of Lisbon. Waves as high as 20 meters, approximately 65 feet, crashed into the city, sweeping away entire neighborhoods. The tsunami added another layer of devastation, drowning people who had survived the earthquake and leaving the city's waterfront completely destroyed. The death toll from the disaster was catastrophic, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to 100,000 people. Many lives were lost in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, while others perished from the fires that continued to ravage the city. Lisbon, once a bustling and vibrant metropolis, was reduced to rubble in just a few hours. The earthquake had transformed the city into a desolate wasteland, and the world would never forget the sheer power of nature that had been unleashed on that fateful day. In the wake of the devastation caused by the earthquake, Lisbon and the rest of the world were left in shock. The disaster not only destroyed the city, but also shook the very foundations of people's beliefs and perceptions of the world. For centuries, religious explanations had provided a framework for understanding natural disasters, and many believed that such catastrophic events were divine punishments for human sins. The tragedy of the Lisbon earthquake, however, led to a profound philosophical shift in how people viewed the forces of nature and their relationship with the divine. Many religious leaders at the time struggled to provide comforting answers to the people of Lisbon, as they had no explanation for why such a horrible event could happen to a city known for its devotion. This lack of answers sparked intense debate across Europe, as people began to question the traditional religious interpretations of disasters like earthquakes. The Lisbon earthquake forced individuals to confront uncomfortable questions about faith, morality, and the nature of divine will. At the same time, the earthquake also played a significant role in the rise of Enlightenment thinking, which was sweeping across Europe during the late 1700s. Philosophers like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau began to challenge the established religious order and question the very idea of divine punishment. They argued that natural disasters were not the result of divine wrath, but rather the result of natural forces that could be understood through science and reason. In his famous poem, Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne, Voltaire criticized the idea that such an event was caused by divine intervention, instead suggesting that earthquakes were simply a result of natural processes that needed to be studied and understood. This shift in thinking marked a turning point in how natural disasters were perceived and set the stage for the development of modern scientific explanations for earthquakes and other catastrophic events. The earthquake of 1755 had inadvertently sparked a new era of intellectual inquiry, where the idea of divine providence began to give way to rational, scientific explanations. It was a crossroads in history, where the traditional religious worldview was increasingly challenged by the emerging ideas of the Enlightenment, forever altering how people would view natural disasters and the world around them. In the aftermath of the devastation caused by the Lisbon earthquake, the city was left in ruins. Amidst the destruction, a remarkable story of resilience and rebuilding began. The task of restoring the city fell to Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis de Pombal, who was appointed by King José I to lead the reconstruction efforts. Pombal, a visionary reformer, quickly set to work, determined to not only rebuild Lisbon, but to create a more modern, safer city that would be better prepared for future disasters. Under Pombal's leadership, the city's reconstruction was approached with a focus on efficiency, practicality, and most importantly, safety. One of the major innovations during this time was the creation of new building codes designed to make structures more resistant to earthquakes. These codes mandated that buildings be constructed with sturdier materials, like stone and iron, and with reinforced walls that could withstand the tremors of future earthquakes. The new designs also included wider streets and open spaces to prevent the rapid spread of fires, which had been one of the most devastating consequences of the previous disaster. In addition to the new architectural standards, the rebuilding process was also shaped by Pombal's desire to create a city that was more organized and accessible. The layout of the city was carefully planned with large straight streets that allowed for better traffic flow and easier movement of people and goods. The reconstruction was not just about rebuilding what had been lost, but about creating a forward-thinking urban center that would stand as a symbol of recovery and resilience. The rebuilding efforts were not without challenges, however. The sheer scale of the destruction made it difficult to restore the city to its former glory, but through meticulous planning, efficient use of resources, and a determination to modernize, Lisbon began to take shape as a new city. By the end of the 1750s, Lisbon had risen from the ashes of the earthquake, emerging as a more resilient and forward-thinking city than it had been before the disaster. The Marquis de Pombal's leadership during this period left a lasting legacy on Lisbon, both in terms of its architecture and urban planning. The earthquake of 1755, while devastating, ultimately led to the transformation of Lisbon into a more modern, safer, and more resilient city. The recovery of Lisbon from the ruins of disaster is a testament to human strength and ingenuity, demonstrating that even in the face of unimaginable loss, the spirit of a city and its people can endure. The aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake reverberated far beyond the city's walls, leaving a lasting impact on both scientific research and cultural understanding. As one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, it not only changed the landscape of Lisbon, but also altered the way the world approached natural disasters. The tragedy of 1755 pushed advancements in seismic research and the development of earthquake-resistant building practices, setting the stage for future generations to better understand and mitigate the destructive power of earthquakes. The earthquake marked the beginning of a more systematic approach to studying earthquakes. In the years that followed, the scientific community began to explore new methods of understanding seismic activity. Theories of plate tectonics, developed centuries later, would trace their origins back to the desire to understand the causes of the Lisbon earthquake. As seismic monitoring techniques advanced, it became possible to predict and prepare for future events in a way that had never been possible before. Beyond the scientific impact, the Lisbon earthquake had a profound influence on art, literature, and philosophy. The tragedy became a central theme in works of literature, particularly in the writings of the Enlightenment thinkers who were profoundly affected by the event. Voltaire's work, Candide, was directly inspired by the earthquake, using it as a way to critique the philosophical optimism of the time. The earthquake also shaped the development of European thought, prompting a shift towards a more rational, evidence-based approaches to understanding the world. The visual arts, too, were shaped by the events of 1755. Paintings and engravings of the disaster depicted the destruction of Lisbon and its people's suffering, capturing the scale and human cost of the earthquake. These works helped to preserve the memory of the disaster and serve as a reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of nature's overwhelming power. Perhaps one of the most significant legacies of the Lisbon earthquake was the shift it caused in how people viewed the relationship between humans and the natural world. The destruction prompted a rethinking of religious interpretations, as well as a growing confidence in the ability of science and reason to explain the forces of nature. It was a turning point in history, where the old world views were challenged and the foundation for modern seismic science was laid. The earthquake's influence continues to be felt today, as it remains one of the most studied natural disasters in history. The lessons learned from the tragedy of 1755 have informed modern earthquake preparedness and building techniques, and the event has become a crucial part of both European history and the broader understanding of how natural disasters shape human society. The legacy of the Lisbon earthquake is not just about the destruction it caused, but also about the resilience, knowledge, and progress it inspired in its wake. It serves as a reminder that while nature's power is immense, humanity's capacity to adapt and rebuild is equally remarkable. In early August of the year 2009, something started brewing quietly over the warm waters of the Western Pacific. Didn't seem like much at first, just a tropical depression forming far out to sea, roughly 1,000 kilometers east of Luzon in the Philippines. But that small storm was the beginning of what would become Typhoon Morakot, a disaster that would go down as the wettest and deadliest typhoon in Taiwan's recorded history. At first, it struggled to stay organized. Meteorologists even downgraded it briefly, thinking it might not develop further. But nature had other plans. Later that same day, the system pulled itself together again. It strengthened slowly but steadily, and by August 3rd, the Japan Meteorological Agency had given it a name, Morakot. In the Philippines, they called it Typhoon Kiko. As the storm moved west, it picked up strength. By August 5th, Morakot had reached typhoon status. The winds had grown stronger, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center recording sustained 1-minute winds of about 150 kilometers per hour. The storm wasn't massive in terms of wind, but what it lacked in brute force, it made up for in size and moisture. This typhoon wasn't just strong, it was slow. That slow movement would be key to the destruction it would later cause. Around this time, countries in its path began issuing warnings. In Japan, gale alerts were sent out across regions like Moji, Yokohama, and Naha. On Okinawa, U.S. military bases raised their tropical cyclone readiness level, preparing for strong winds. In the Philippines, authorities warned residents in northern Luzon and nearby islands that the storm could bring heavy rain, not necessarily from direct impact, but by enhancing the southwest monsoon. As expected, that monsoon would later lead to deadly flooding in parts of the country, killing over 24 people. But Taiwan was about to face the worst of it. On August 5th, the Central Weather Bureau there issued a sea typhoon alert. Just 2 days later, Morakot reached its peak strength with a pressure of 945 millibars and wind speeds that matched a Category 1 hurricane. Then it started creeping toward the island, very slowly. That's when the real trouble began. On the morning of August 7th, 2009, Typhoon Morakot made landfall in Taiwan. Although it had weakened from its peak intensity, the storm brought with it an overwhelming force of wind and rain. The winds were strong enough to uproot trees and damage rooftops, but it was the rain that would leave the most lasting impact. As the typhoon stalled over the island, it unleashed an unprecedented amount of rainfall. Some areas recorded over 100 inches within a span of just 3 days. The steep mountains of southern and central Taiwan, already vulnerable to landslides, quickly became saturated. Hillsides gave way, sending waves of mud and debris crashing into everything in their path. Entire villages were cut off, as roads were buried and bridges were swept away by rising rivers. Rivers overflowed their banks, submerging streets and homes under muddy water. In the city of Tainan and the surrounding regions, families were forced to evacuate quickly as floodwaters rose faster than anyone expected. The nonstop rain overwhelmed drainage systems, triggered flash floods, and isolated dozens of towns. Military personnel were deployed to assist, but many areas were unreachable. Helicopters flew through heavy rain to drop supplies as thousands of people were left without shelter, food, or clean water. While Typhoon Morakot continued to drift slowly away from Taiwan, the destruction it caused was only beginning to reveal itself. One of the most devastating consequences of Typhoon Morakot unfolded in a remote area of southern Taiwan. On the morning of August 8th, just 1 day after the typhoon made landfall, the village of Xiaolin in Kaohsiung County faced a disaster unlike anything in recent memory. After more than 48 hours of intense rainfall, the mountains above the village could no longer hold. A massive landslide was triggered, described by witnesses as a roaring wall of earth and rock that descended without warning. Within moments, nearly the entire village was buried. Hundreds of homes were completely destroyed, and many residents had no time to escape. Only a small number of villagers managed to survive by fleeing to higher ground or clinging to the edges of the landslide zone. Rescue crews were delayed due to washed-out roads and unstable terrain, and helicopters were the only way to reach the area. When rescuers finally arrived, they were met with a scene of total destruction. Rooftops barely visible above the mud, and entire families missing. Search efforts continued for days, but the scale of the landslide made recovery nearly impossible. The soil was unstable, and heavy machinery could not reach the site without risking further collapse. By the end of the operation, it was estimated that over 400 people had lost their lives in Xiaolin alone. The tragedy became a symbol of the typhoon's deadly impact. For many across Taiwan, it marked a painful turning point, revealing how a single storm could change the course of countless lives in an instant. While the tragedy in Xiaolin village captured global attention, Typhoon Morakot's devastation extended far beyond a single location. Across Taiwan, countless communities faced widespread destruction. Roads were torn apart by rushing floodwaters, over 1,000 bridges were damaged or washed away, and vital transportation routes were rendered impassable. In the mountainous regions, dozens of smaller villages became isolated, cut off from help for several days. Agricultural regions in southern Taiwan suffered tremendous losses. Farmland was submerged for days, wiping out rice, banana, and vegetable crops that families depended on for both income and survival. Livestock drowned in flooded pens, and storage facilities filled with mud and debris. Farmers described the destruction as a complete reset of their livelihoods, with years of work undone in mere hours. Hospitals and emergency shelters quickly reached capacity. Over 20,000 people were forced to evacuate and spent weeks in temporary shelters, set up in schools, stadiums, and military camps. These facilities were crowded and under-resourced, making it difficult for authorities to provide basic supplies such as food, water, and medicine. The scale of the disaster drew international attention. Countries including the United States, Japan, and South Korea offered financial assistance and sent rescue teams to support Taiwan's overwhelmed emergency services. Charitable organizations and NGOs also stepped in, distributing supplies and helping displaced families find temporary housing. In response to the growing crisis, Taiwan's government faced mounting pressure to act quickly. Military helicopters were dispatched to deliver aid and airlift the injured. Engineers worked around the clock to rebuild access roads and restore power and communication lines. Despite these efforts, many citizens criticized the government's initial response as too slow, especially in the first critical days after the storm. The aftermath of Typhoon Morakot became not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a national reckoning, forcing Taiwan to confront the weaknesses in its disaster response system and infrastructure planning. In the weeks and months after Typhoon Morakot left Taiwan, the country began the long and painful road to recovery. Entire communities had to be relocated, especially in mountainous regions where the land was no longer stable. More than 40 villages were declared unsafe to live in, and thousands of survivors were moved to newly constructed housing sites built by the government and aid groups. While these new homes offered safety, many families struggled with the emotional toll of being separated from ancestral land and lifelong neighbors. The emotional scars of the disaster ran deep. Families who had lost loved ones or whose homes were swept away had to cope with trauma and grief while rebuilding their lives from the ground up. Schools reopened, but some classrooms had empty seats that would never be filled again. Survivors organized memorial events to honor the dead, especially those lost in Jiaolin village. These gatherings became a space for both mourning and community healing. Government officials soon launched a full investigation into how the disaster had unfolded. Studies revealed that poor land use policies, unregulated construction in vulnerable areas, and outdated flood management systems had made the damage far worse than it needed to be. In response, Taiwan introduced major changes in its disaster prevention planning. New laws were passed to ban construction in high-risk areas, and investment in early warning systems was significantly increased. Internationally, Typhoon Morakot also served as a warning. It became a case study in how slow-moving tropical storms can be just as dangerous as fast, powerful typhoons. Meteorologists and emergency planners around the world began rethinking how to measure storm threats, focusing more on rainfall and flood risk rather than just wind speed. By the one-year anniversary of the storm, Taiwan had made major progress in rebuilding, but the impact of Typhoon Morakot continued to shape the nation's approach to disaster resilience. It was no longer just about reacting to storms, it was about preparing for them with better science, better infrastructure, and stronger community support. Typhoon Morakot did not just leave behind destruction or it changed how a country understood nature's power and how human decisions could either lessen or worsen that impact. The storm remains one of the most important reminders in Taiwan's modern history that resilience is not only about rebuilding, but about learning, adapting, and never forgetting what was lost. It was a quiet Saturday morning on March 22, 2014. The small community of Oso, Washington, sat peacefully about 4 miles east of the main town center, tucked beside the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River. The neighborhood just south of the river, known as Steelhead Haven, was mostly made up of families and longtime residents who loved the peacefulness of living out there in the woods. The weather had been wet for weeks, nearly double. The usual rainfall had fallen over the previous month and a half, but nobody was too alarmed. Rain in western Washington wasn't anything new. At 10:37 that morning, everything changed. Without any warning, a huge chunk of the hillside just north of Steelhead Haven suddenly gave way. In seconds, a wave of mud, trees, and broken earth came roaring across the river like a wall of destruction. People who saw it later described it as sounding like a freight train. Others called it a tsunami made of dirt. The river didn't stand a chance. it was swallowed up. The mud barreled forward, slamming directly into the neighborhood. In just moments, 49 homes and structures were buried under the thick, wet earth. Everything in its path disappeared. The debris covered an area nearly 1 square mile wide. That's about the size of 700 football fields, just to picture it. And the mud didn't just sit on top, it dug in deep, as much as 70 feet in some spots. People miles away felt the ground shake. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network picked up the vibrations from the collapse almost instantly. Later on, scientists figured out the initial slide had lasted around 2.5 minutes, but there were aftershocks and smaller slides that continued for hours. Emergency responders were on the scene as fast as they could get there. Helicopters from the nearby Naval Air Station on Whidbey Island flew in, and local firefighters and medics from all over Snohomish County rushed to help, but the situation was already devastating. What they found was a complete disaster zone. In those first few hours, 8 people were pulled from the debris alive. That gave families hope. But as the day turned to night, it became clear that many people had not made it out in time. 43 lives were eventually lost, making this the deadliest single landslide in American history, not caused by an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or dam collapse. By that night, the state's Lieutenant Governor Brad Owen had declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the site in a helicopter to see the damage himself. What he saw from the sky was unimaginable. What had once been a quiet rural neighborhood now looked like the aftermath of a natural bomb going off, just a sea of broken trees, twisted houses, and endless mud. And this was only the beginning. After the deadly landslide hit Oso on the morning of March 22nd, 2014, the scene left behind was nearly impossible to believe. Trees were ripped from the ground like weeds. Homes had been picked up and tossed or buried under thick, heavy layers of mud and debris. It wasn't just a collapse, it looked like the land itself had exploded. What once had been a peaceful riverside neighborhood, known as Steelhead Haven, was now an unrecognizable field of destruction stretching over 1 square mile. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, even though access was incredibly difficult. The massive flow of mud had completely blocked off State Route 530, the main road in and out of the area. This made it nearly impossible for emergency crews to get to the site quickly. Some responders had to arrive by helicopter, others took back roads through the mountains, some of which were still covered in snow. Despite the danger, more than 100 first responders showed up that day from all around Snohomish County and neighboring counties. Firefighters, police, paramedics, and volunteers all joined forces. Even the Navy's search and rescue team from Whidbey Island got involved. They all worked together, digging through the muck with whatever they had, from heavy equipment to their bare hands. As they worked, everyone was holding out hope for survivors. On that first day, 8 people were rescued from the debris and rushed to nearby hospitals. Some had been trapped in what was left of their homes. Others were found clinging to pieces of wood barely above the mud line. Every minute counted and the clock was ticking fast. But even as help poured in, the weather remained a major challenge. The ground was still soaked from weeks of rain leading up to the slide. It made the mud deep, sticky, and unstable. Equipment would get stuck, roads kept washing out, and the river itself, the North Fork of the Stillaguamish, had been completely blocked by the slide, creating a massive backup of water. Officials worried that if the natural dam gave way, it could cause even more damage downstream. A flash flood watch was issued just in case. Meanwhile, the community of Oso and nearby Darrington, a small mountain town about 16 miles east, were essentially cut off. Supplies had to be airlifted in, and families desperately waited for any word about their missing loved ones. The scope of the disaster became clearer by the hour. Entire families were unaccounted for. Some homes had vanished without a trace. As night fell on March 22nd, the Lieutenant Governor of Washington declared a state of emergency. The next day, Governor Jay Inslee flew over the scene. What he saw from the air was heartbreaking. A vast brown wasteland where a tight-knit neighborhood used to stand. And still, the rescuers worked. Mud-caked and exhausted, they searched on, refusing to give up hope. Behind them, the mountains stood silent, as if holding their breath. The search would only grow larger in the coming days, and the heartbreak deeper. In the days following the Oso Landslide, search and recovery efforts became a grueling, round-the-clock mission. Crews were no longer hoping for a miracle. They were now searching for the missing and trying to bring closure to grieving families. The wall of mud had buried everything under layers that reached up to 75 feet in some spots. The scale was staggering and the conditions remained brutal. As more federal resources arrived, including teams from FEMA and the National Guard, the operation grew in both size and complexity. Hundreds of workers took part in a carefully coordinated effort. Cadaver dogs were brought in to locate human remains. GPS mapping tools helped chart out the disaster zone in small sections. Every day, workers braved thick, unstable ground that could shift without warning. Heavy machinery slowly cleared debris, but many areas could only be reached by foot. Volunteers waded through cold, muddy water, searching for signs of life or loss. The river, still blocked by the natural dam, was rising slowly behind the slide, creating fears of a secondary flood. Engineers worked urgently to carve a new channel and relieve pressure on the fragile barrier. Meanwhile, the community pulled together in powerful ways. Churches opened their doors to families in need. Local restaurants cooked meals for rescue teams. Donations poured in from across the state and beyond. Blankets, supplies, and financial help for displaced residents. The town of Arlington, located west of the slide, became a staging point where families waited anxiously for news. Identification of the victims proved difficult. Many bodies were found far from where their homes had stood, carried by the force of the debris. Personal items, toys, clothing, photo albums, were retrieved and set aside, each one a clue to someone's life. Medical examiners worked carefully to identify remains and provide answers to families who had been left in limbo. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people were confirmed dead. Dozens were still missing. Memorials began to appear on the roadside. Wooden crosses, flowers, and handwritten notes to the lost. Each name that was recovered brought both sorrow and a measure of peace to those waiting. There was also growing scrutiny over how such a tragedy could happen. Questions emerged about whether the area had been safe to build on in the first place. The hillside that collapsed had a long history of instability. Past slides had occurred in the same location, including one large event in the year 2006, but a few people seemed to have known the full risk, and now those decisions were under the microscope. Still, the focus remained on the people. The victims, the survivors, and the hundreds of workers doing the hard and heartbreaking job of recovery. Every shovel of mud, every item found, every name spoken aloud, it all mattered deeply, and this was no longer just a rescue effort. It had become a solemn promise to honor those who were lost and stand by the families left behind. In the weeks that followed the Oso landslide, Washington state and federal officials began a deeper investigation into what had gone wrong. The shock of the disaster gave way to tough questions. Questions about land use, environmental oversight, and public safety. Geologists and engineers were among the first to study the collapse site in detail. They discovered that the slide had started high on a hillside known to have moved before. Layers of loose, water-saturated soil had given way all at once. What had made this event different was its speed and violence. The slope did not slump gradually, it exploded outward in a single catastrophic motion. Experts found that rainfall had played a major role. March had been one of the wettest months on record in the region. The saturated ground became unstable, and the Stillaguamish River at the base of the hill had been slowly eroding the slope for years. When the collapse came on March 22nd, everything gave way in seconds, but the science led to harder truths. Public records showed that the area had experienced multiple landslides in the past. Some maps dated back to the 1940s and showed danger zones marked clearly. A particularly large slide in the year 2006 had left behind warning signs. Despite this, homes had been rebuilt and new permits had been issued. Residents later said they had not been warned about the full extent of the risk. Some knew there had been previous slides, but few understood just how unstable the ground truly was. That lack of communication became a central concern. State and local agencies had data, but it had not always been shared clearly or acted upon quickly enough. The tragedy also exposed weaknesses in building policies. There were no federal laws that prevented people from constructing homes in known landslide zones. Local regulations varied from county to county, and in rural areas like Oso, oversight was limited. The disaster showed how vulnerable communities could be when information and regulation failed to align. Public hearings were soon held. Survivors, scientists, and lawmakers spoke about what needed to change. There was a growing sense that better mapping, clearer warnings, and stricter construction rules were all essential to preventing another event like this one. Meanwhile, environmental specialists studied the long-term effects of the slide. The Stillaguamish River had been rerouted by the debris, affecting fish habitats and downstream water quality. Replanting efforts began in damaged forest areas, but recovery would take years. The land, like the people, had been deeply scarred. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued, and the focus gradually shifted from recovery to resilience. Washington State began reviewing land use policies. Experts pushed for stronger protections and better public awareness campaigns. The lessons from Oso were hard-earned, but they could not be ignored. Behind every technical report and policy change were the lives of the 43 people who had died. Each decision going forward carried the weight of their memory. The question was no longer what had happened. It was how to make sure it never happened again. Years after the Oso landslide, the community and state have worked to rebuild not just the physical landscape, but also the sense of safety and hope for the future. Memorials were established to honor the 43 lives lost, serving as reminders of the tragedy and the resilience of those left behind. In the aftermath, Washington lawmakers passed new regulations aimed at reducing risk in vulnerable areas. These policies required more comprehensive geological surveys before construction permits could be granted. Additionally, counties were mandated to improve emergency preparedness, including better evacuation plans for landslide-prone zones. Technology also played a growing role. Remote sensing tools such as LiDAR and satellite imaging became essential in monitoring hillside movement. These advancements helped experts identify early warning signs that might have gone unnoticed before. Public agencies began issuing alerts when unstable ground was detected, giving residents precious time to evacuate. Local schools and community centers incorporated landslide education into their programs. Teaching residents about natural hazards became a priority, fostering a culture of awareness. Drills were held regularly so families would know how to respond if a disaster struck again. Economically, the region faced challenges. The destruction of homes and infrastructure caused significant setbacks. However, investments in rebuilding efforts created new jobs and encouraged community revitalization. Infrastructure improvements, including stronger bridges and better drainage systems, helped protect against future floods and slides. Researchers continued to study Oso as a case example of landslide dynamics and a disaster response. Scientific papers published around the world referenced the event, contributing to global understanding of how such disasters unfold. The lessons learned have influenced safety practices far beyond Washington's borders. Despite progress, the memory of the landslide remains vivid. Survivors and families of victims carry their grief quietly but firmly. Community support groups formed, providing a space to share stories and heal together. Oso's story stands as a powerful warning. It shows how nature's forces can change lives in an instant, and how preparation, respect for science, and strong community ties are essential to facing the unknown. The legacy of the March 22, 2014 landslide is one of tragedy and hope. It is a call to action, to listen to the land, to act with urgency, and to remember those who can no longer speak for themselves. Through these efforts, Oso continues forward, determined to build a safer tomorrow.